a lot of people see Jane Austen as an apolitical writer. They see her as somebody who's doing these wonderful novels on manners, and they're comedies. They all have happy endings. But for those, I think, who've studied Jane Austen quite deeply, and some of the writers that I've read, Tony Tanner is one, and Michael Giffen is another, and there are a few others. I read a very interesting work on Jane Austen and the French Revolution, even though she does not really even talk much. There's only allusions to the French Revolution, but she was very steeped in her times. She was also an extraordinary reader. She grew up in a house. Her father was a graduate of Oxford, and he was a clergyman and had a very substantial library. This was pre-television, when people read a lot. If they were educated, they entertained themselves. So one of the arguments that I had with my father, argument in the good sense of that word, not in like fighting something, was whether she had reached what is sometimes termed as the anagogical level. My argument was that she had, and the anagogical level in writing is the highest level because it has a spiritual interpretation. He felt she was more at the moral and the allegorical levels. So this comes from a schema that was used in traditional Christian exegesis, where you looked at the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and then the anagogical. My argument was that she had reached that, and so I was happy because I took my sons several years ago on a pilgrimage to her house in Southampton, and I found a book there that totally confirmed my argument, which I later gloated with my father. In any case, the only way that there's arguments, there's something that is called the death of the author, and this is a very common postmodern approach to literature, which is this idea that books are whatever they mean to whoever reads them. It's really not important what the author was intending. It's more important what your own experience of a novel is. And there is an argument, because a lot of people can read many things into things. Poetry is very often interpreted in very different ways. In the Islamic tradition, we have something called isnad, and part of the isnad tradition was to maintain the intentions of the author, so that you read through a chain and you had commentary. And while they do differ sometimes, overall you get, over time, a consistency of meaning, and that enables people of much later periods to understand people of earlier periods. So for instance, Foucault, in his idea of the archaeology of knowledge, that when we look back at, say, Plato, for instance, we really can't understand Plato because it's like going to Stonehenge and trying to figure out what they were doing. There's nobody there to tell us exactly what they were doing. So we can look at it archaeologically and try to figure out what they were doing, and it certainly had something to do with astronomy, and it was certainly aligned with sunrise and sunset and other things. But ultimately, was it a scientific center? Was it a religious center? Was it a little bit of both? We don't really know. We can't know because we don't have any written articles about that. So, but great authors definitely have a purpose. Just an example of that is if you look at Melville, who was not considered great during his lifetime, and it was probably very difficult for him, Herman Melville. He wrote, obviously, Moby Dick, and it was the English that discovered Moby Dick, not the Americans. So it actually became a much popular novel amongst intellectuals here because they recognized the greatness of it. Most scholars, I think, would consider it the greatest novel that the Americans have produced. But what is Moby Dick about? It's this big giant whale, and he's white, and It's a lot of brown and black people on a ship run by white people trying to kill this white whale. There is an argument that it really is about white supremacy. And that was my conclusion in reading it. I called up a friend of mine, Chris Hedges, who he and I kind of share a love for literature, and we've talked about literature on different occasions. But I asked him, I said, because I knew he knew Moby Dick well, he said, I said, do you think it's about white supremacy? Like, is he talking about, like, you know, killing the white whale? And he said, absolutely. And he said, you haven't read James? I said, no. And so he kind of turned me on to this Jamaican writer who interpreted Moby Dick. So there's an argument for that. And if you've never read Benito Cereno, I would recommend that you go home tonight and find Benito Cereno, because it's an extraordinary story that Melville wrote about a Muslim rebellion on a slave ship, and it kind of confirms this idea that Melville had traveled around the world and had seen how Europeans and Americans were treating a lot of these native peoples, and he was very distressed by it because he's a deeply compassionate man. So whether it really is about that or not, you will find people debating. My conclusion is that he was definitely talking about that. Moby Dick, actually, it turns out, and I didn't find this, I actually discovered this on my own. Moby Dick was a ship that was used to take freed slaves from the south to the north. There's a very interesting character on the ship. He's a little black boy. And he's learning Murray's grammar, which was, it was illegal to teach black people grammar in the southern states. You could teach them to read, but you couldn't teach them grammar. Very interesting. So this look at this is really based on, I think, a very, very intentional author. Virginia Woolf, who I know nothing about, but I know this quote. Virginia Woolf said, I know who's afraid of Virginia Woolf, but I think I am, because I've actually never read her, but Virginia Woolf said that Jane Austen, among the great writers, is the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because one, she is a very just enjoyable writer, and many of the great writers challenge you, and they take a little time to get into, and once you do, I think they become much more enjoyable. But she can be almost a breezy writer for some. They can read her just as a good yarn. But her greatness is in the incredible sophistication of her writing, and she repays rereading because she's extremely subtle, and you miss a lot of things, as in any great writer. So a little bit of historical background. These periods, like the English Civil War, which ends up with the beheading of Charles I, which is a major event in English history because the English largely still believed in the divine right of kings, and so the idea of cutting the head of a king off was really a type of blasphemy, because there was a belief that God put the king there, and this was a fallen way of representing divine rule, that God rules over all of us, we're God's subjects, and this hierarchy or sacred rule, hieros arche, which is Greek for sacred rule, was really part of the divine plan. So Cromwell is a very interesting character. They create this rump parliament and basically oust the king and end up beheading him. And it's very interesting because you had these levelers, they were called the levelers, and these were really radical. I mean, they wanted to eliminate all hierarchy, so they were really almost like anarchists. And Ireton and Cromwell, there were these other groups that said, no, we need to have some semblance of order here. And you can see this also in Qarun, in the Quran, Korah, in the Bible. The Quran just alludes to his bagha alayhim. That's all the Quran says about Korah's political position, which was that he aggressed upon them because Korah or Qarun took 200 of the Bani Israel and basically opposed the rule of Moses because he said, we're all equal, we're all Bani Israel, who do you think you are, why should you be over us? So this is a very human impulse of just, why should there be somebody over me? And certain peoples have this more than other people. Some people really, really have a hard time with any kind of order. But the English Civil Wars were just a very, very difficult period in England, and ends up with the beheading of the king. And then there's a period of the Commonwealth. Cromwell establishes himself as protector of the realm. And then there's the Great Restoration period. They finally are able, I mean, obviously there's a Catholic-Protestant problem with the Stuarts. For those of you, probably you know English history much better than I do. But in any case, it ends up with Charles II is restored to the monarchy, and then you get the last invasion of England that was successful by William of Orange and Mary. But then something really interesting happens, which is when you move into the Hanover line, you get the rebellion of the Americans. And they begin their rebellion the year Jane Austen is born, which is 1775. In 1776, they have a Declaration of Independence. And then this is really the first secular rebellion and revolution, as far as we know, in history. And it's one of the very interesting things about America is it's established really as a secular state. I mean, there are now Christian nationalists who would like to argue that no, it was always a Christian state. But the truth is that it was established as a secular state. They were informed by Christianity, that is undeniable. But some of them were atheists, some of them were deists, some of them were Unitarians, some of them were Baptists, some of them were Anglicans, and Maryland was the great Catholic state, so there were even some Catholics that signed on the Declaration of Independence. But when the Americans made a treaty with Tripoli, they actually have in the 11th article of that treaty, it's written in Arabic. It's not written in Arabic, but it's written in English. So they didn't translate it into Arabic because the Arabs would have never understood it. It says, America was not founded on any religion, and therefore it has no animosity towards the Mohammedans or their laws or their traditions. And this will never be a source of enmity between America and the Muslim world. And so that was published in all the American newspapers. And Joel Barlow, who was a close friend of George Washington, he was the one that basically enacted that treaty. And that treaty still stands in the United States. It's there. So it's a very clear declaration that America was a secular state. They did not translate it into Arabic because the Arabs would have never understood that. So these are the revolutionary times that Jane Austen is born into. And then you have the storming of the Bastille in 1789. So Jane is obviously very aware of these things. She had a cousin who was married to a French aristocrat who actually lost his head in the revolution. She lived with them for a period. Eliza Hancock, I can't pronounce her name, it's a French name. And she knew her very well, so she would have been very aware of the French Revolution and what was happening. And it created a lot of disturbance in the United Kingdom because this was real attacks on the aristocracy. And Even though things were rapidly changing, and Jane Austen is living in a time like our own of immense and rapid change, the rapidity of our own change, I think, can't be compared because of the nature of the technology that we have. But this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine is just being discovered. Railroads are coming very soon. There's a lot of changes. Female education is changing. There were many writers at this time in the Georgian period. There were many female writers writing novels. And the novels of sensibility were very common. This is the Romantic period. There was a lot of people that were frustrated by this idea of reason becoming the arbiter. They felt reason had reigned too long. And so the romantics, the romantic poetry, all of these things are beginning to emerge. So if you look at, when you look at the novel of Sense and Sensibility, she has these two heroines. One is Marianne, the other is Eleanor. Well, her names are very significant, and Jane Austen, even the names of her estates are significant. She's not always doing it, but I think very often she is using names to put out ideas. The name Marianne was the personification of the Republic of France. So Marianne personified liberty. She is the goddess of liberty. And if you look at Marianne as a character in this novel, Marianne is a free spirit. I would argue that today, for those of you who know the novel, Marianne would have purple hair, she would have tattoos all over her body, she would have piercings. This is how she would express that kind of freedom. But the type of society she was in curtailed that kind of wildness that is so common today in the Mariannes of our world. They also wore this Phrygian cap, which was a cap during the French Revolution. They wore it because it was the cap that freed slaves wore in the Byzantine world. And so it was a symbol of the slave rebellion against this hierarchy that had ruled them for too long. And so you see that. And so you'll see all these images of Marianne here. They're all even the Arabs are there, and the Africans, and the Chinese, the Asians are showing obeisance to Marianne. Believe it or not, this was a gift from France to the United States. So this is also modeled because Marianne held up the torch of liberty. So this is the revolutionary spirit that's moving at the time, and Marianne's was equality, fraternity, liberty, equality, fraternity. This was the slogan of the goddess of liberty, that people should be free, there's this brotherhood of man, and there's no hierarchy anymore. So this Georgian age is a very interesting period. She's living during the Regency time because obviously the king went a little crazy. There was not a lot of popularity for the regent, but you had a lot of Georges in those days. But it's a very interesting period. It was a period of a lot of manners, but a lot of shifting because the gentry is becoming more powerful. You're seeing a lot of people that traditionally would not have had wealth that are coming into wealth because of the nature of the commerce, the type of capitalistic it's moving, not just from agrarian capitalism, which was the more standard source of wealth, but now you're getting this global economy. You've got these sugar plantations in the Jamaicas that are making huge amounts of money. You have the slave trade, although, and I think it's one of the great testimonies of the English people, something they should be very proud of, the real anti-slavery movement begins here. There were some anti-slavery movements in West Africa amongst the Muslims. Omar Tal is one of the most famous ones. But unfortunately, the Muslims did not do a whole lot to eliminate slavery. Chattel slavery was very rare in the Muslim world. It did exist, but it was more domestic servitude. And there are, for people that want to go into that, but when the Ottomans finally did abolish slavery, when they sent the Firman to Mecca, some of the slavers just killed the Ottoman, so they weren't happy about that. But the British, the English did a lot, and in 1807, I mean, obviously Mansfield, and I think that's probably where Jane Austen named Mansfield Park. So Lord Mansfield has two major judgments against slavers. One of them involved a slave who came from the Indies with his owner, and then because he was on free soil in England, he argued that he was no longer a slave. At the lower courts, they actually argued against it, but Mansfield overturned that, and he was actually freed. So this happens in the late 1700s, and then he made another case against a slave ship, Zong, which they threw 134 slaves overboard because the ship was in danger of sinking. And so then they sued the insurance company for cargo indemnity. So they wanted to get money for the slaves they lost. And it was initially upheld, but then Lord Mansfield again, he overturned that and argued that they did not have to pay. And that could be seen two ways, obviously, because that's corporations getting out of. But I think for him, it was definitely because he was opposed to slavery. Jane Austen, I think, would have definitely been opposed to slavery given her family. Her brother Henry was an anti-slavery delegate after her in 1840. She definitely was aware of the horrors of slavery because both of her brothers were in the African squadron. So she and one of her brothers was involved in actually stopping the English Navy actually stopped over 1,600 slave ships after transatlantic slavery was abolished. And it was a massive expenditure. So this was from people like William Wilberforce and Hannah More, the great Hannah More, Aquino Auda. I mean, these are the great, there's a beautiful book by Hirsch called Breaking the Chains about this story. It's worth reading because people should know that history. We've got probably more slaves today than any time in human history, according to Interpol, because there's so much trafficking of human beings today. So this is not a problem that's gone away. It's a problem that, and governments probably are less, because these governments these were evangelicals. I mean, people forget that it was the evangelicals that ended slavery. This was a Christian movement. This was not a secular movement. These were devoutly religious people that believed that it was unholy to hold others in bondage and to treat them like animals. Again, even animals obviously shouldn't be treated like that. In any case, Jane Austen, you know, her life is quite short, and it's amazing she was able to accomplish what she did. She's already writing from a very early period. She writes her Juvenilia, which are, I actually have her history of England, of the English kings and queens, and then she wrote a epistolary novel, which is letters back and forth, and then she starts working, I think, on Pride and Prejudice, but the first published one is Sense and Sensibility, which originally was letters between the two, and it was called Marianne and Eleanor. But she's born in 1775 and dies in 1817. This is a very interesting period in British history, and then it's followed by the Great Victorian period, of which we can see the remnants of that amazing period just in the extraordinary buildings here in downtown Bradford when you see these stunning buildings that were built at the height of the Great Victorian age. This is 19th century engraving of her, and she had a very interesting life. She was highly educated. She did go to a private school. She got very sick. She came home, but she was homeschooled, voracious reader, had access to the library. She was also a tomboy. She was noted for playing cricket, which was very uncouth for girls of her time to do things like that. She preferred male company to female company. In those days, they used to move into two different rooms. and the women did not discuss politics. It was impolite for them to do that. And this was also the age of news, so newspapers were becoming more popular. But I think she wearied of vacuous conversation. You see that constantly in her novels. She just does not like vacuous conversation. So just looking at the names in Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor is a Hebrew name which means the light of God. El is one of the names of God, which is related to Elohim, Ilah, Allah, according to one derivation. Some argue that Allah is not from Al-Ilah in any case. And then Nur is just light, which is Hebrew and Arabic. I mentioned earlier that Marianne was from the French Revolution, counter-revolutions called the Republic Marianne, and the revolutionists took it as a badge of pride that personified liberty, equality, and fraternity, usually in the form of a bare-breasted woman named Marianne, to kind of show the freedom that she had. This was also an interesting period because Wollstonecraft was writing on the vindication of women, which was a response to Burke's on the vindication of the rights of men. Burke, who Jane Austen was very familiar with, was somebody who wrote a scathing refutation of the French Revolution. He's called the father of conservatism. But Burke was also, he was an extraordinary man. And to associate him with a kind of modern conservative, this idea of the Republican Party in America, or the Conservative Party here, would be really just a gross miscalculation, because he fought hard for Irish rights. He also fought hard for Indian rights. He was very horrified by what was happening with the East India Company. He sued Warren Hastings, attempted to have him tried. Hastings actually came out on top. But she was very familiar with Edmund Burke and would have been very comfortable with his type of conservatism. Edward is Old English for a fortune guard, so ward, a ward of the state is related to that. And then Colonel Brandon, who's another character, Brandon is Welsh for prince. You will see in all of her novels, she has a dysfunctional estate, and then she has an estate that is either a parsonage that's also dysfunctional. Usually they go together because she's very concerned about the secular estate and the sacred estate, which is the parsonage. And this is the Georgian Anglican world. But she really understands this idea of the fallen state and that things aren't working. So you will see these estates are always dysfunctional in her novels. The father is usually, something's going on with the father. You can see this in Pride and Prejudice with the Bennets in the Longbourn estate, where the father's checked out. He's kind of, our lives are just laughing at our neighbors. This is his idea of, he's very cynical, he's a very witty man, and he's closest to Elizabeth. But the mother's a mess. She's always just running around with her head cut off. And she's got these daughters. They're all worried about how they're going to get them married, because this was so central to life at that time. What's really fascinating about her, Jane, also, is that she really, the feminists want to take her and make her their own, but she is as sympathetic to the vulnerabilities of the male as she is to the female. And you will see some of the most wicked characters in her novels are women. She's an equal opportunity assessor. She's not siding with one gender over the other. She definitely advocates for her gender. In her letters, and she had a great correspondence with her sister when they were away from each other, Cassandra. And her mother was also not really a notable poet, but she did write poetry, and we still have some of it. But she was a great wit. And I think I see Jane as a kind of Miss Austen, as a she's really in her early period, and in many of her novels, there's kind of this nafs al-awama, this is what we call nafs al-awama. She really struggles with herself because she has a biting wit, and she sees the foibles of people. She really can see through how ridiculous we are as a species, and she's constantly doing it, but she feels a lot of guilt about this. And I think probably one of the greatest examples of that is Miss Bates and Emma in the famous picnic scene, which people who know Emma know that scene very well. It's a very powerful scene where she mocks this poor spinster, and because she's under the influence of a negative male character. But Mr. Knightley, he calls her back to that higher self and just reminds her about why she has to have a kind of noblesse oblige. That Miss Bates is, you know, a very sympathetic and poor character, and it was just very badly done, as he tells her, what she did to him. And I think that, to me, that's probably Jane Austen's reflection on her own self. She probably was in that situation on many occasions, and you can see it in her letters. And then there's Lucy Steele. I don't know if I'm pushing this, you know, but Lucy Steele is definitely one of her most wicked characters. So one of the things that she does with her, she does what Shakespeare does, is that she will, if you'll notice, her kind of low characters speak bad English. So they're like double negatives, and they're not educated, they're uncouth. Shakespeare does this because when he has the vulgar characters come in, he actually breaks. A lot of people don't notice this if they're not aware of the iambic pentameter, but he will break the iambic pentameter when he has the lower characters. This is probably first done, Allahu Alam, but it's probably first done by Homer in the Iliad, because there's a great character in the chapter 2, which my dad always thought, you know, because they say Homer nods, you know, when there's the catalog of the ships, everybody falls asleep in chapter 2. But my dad actually thought it was a really important chapter, but one of the most important things in there is Thersites. So Thersites is the character in the Iliad. So Agamemnon wants to test the Greeks about their staying power. So he tells them, let's pack up and go back to Greece. And they're all like, great. You know, and they start packing up. He's really upset about it. And they said, no, I was just testing you. But there's one character, Thersites, who is described by Homer. He's very creepy. He's like deformed. He's got like his hair's kind of got wires on his head. And he's like calls out, but he's just one of the foot soldiers. He's not one of the notables, because the only people that speak in Homer's Odyssey are the aristocrats. And Odysseus kind of just knocks him down with a stick. You cur, how dare you speak in the presence of... And everybody, even though they were all sympathetic with Thersites, because all the soldiers felt it, like, what are we doing here? We're just fighting for these guys. So this is something that you will see in a lot of classical literature, where just the kind of disdain for the lower classes. And this obviously is a big problem. But she definitely, Lucy Steele is a very, not a very inspiring character. But, so if you look, this would be something that Jane Austen was very familiar with, which is the idea of the cardinal virtues. I'm certain she would have read the Nicomachean Ethics, which was a very, very commonly studied book of ethics at that time. The idea of prudence, courage, and temperance. So this is the idea of logos, thumos, and eros. So this is the way the human body was designed. And this is why, you know, the head, Aristotle said, you know, the head is where, you know, the reason resides, and that's why it's on the top. And then the thumos is the spirit, the irascible soul, and then eros is the stomach and the genitals, and these are this is the balance. So this is vertical alignment. So when these are in harmony, then you get justice. And so if you look at her novel here, Eleanor personifies, and Eleanor is very young. She's less than 20 in the novel. Marianne's only 17. Eleanor's 19. But she personifies wisdom. She's already wise. And the poor mother, she's more in the irascible soul. She's very angry. She feels a grave injustice has been done to her. She, first of all, the Norland is it's not in good shape. The father was not really a good caretaker for it. And then because of the inheritance, it's going to go to his eldest, to the son from a previous marriage. He makes him promise, obviously, that he will take care of them. And then Fanny, his wife, comes along and convinces him, oh, he couldn't have met material wealth. And by the end of it, he initially plans to give them a pretty reasonable sum at that time. But by the end of it, it's pretty much nothing. So they have to leave this amazing estate that is in disarray, though. And the three girls, they're the only one that's really handling it well is Eleanor, because she's not in her feeling state. She's thinking, so she's rational. And then obviously Marianne just personifies the lack of temperance. It's the concupiscent soul. It's the eros that overwhelms her. So when you look, Jane Austen is writing in what's called the neoclassical period. She can't be understood as a modern writer. If you move into the Victorian age, which the Bronte sisters are from here, when you start moving into the writers, they're very different writers from the time that she's writing in, but she's very much informed by high Anglican metaphysics, what's called the economy of salvation. She really understands something. And Hannah More, who she did respect, and she liked Hannah More, but she did not like the evangelicals. And she didn't really like Hannah More's writing, because Hannah More, who was a very great secular playwright in London, she was hailed in London. When she became very religious, she became an evangelical with Wilberforce, and then teamed up to fight against the slavery. She basically she wrote these didactic novels. And a didactic novel is obviously this moralistic novel where it preaches to you. Jane Austen is writing didactic novels, but in such a subtle way that it's very easy to miss it. But she is definitely writing didactic novels. And I think any other reading of her would be unfair to her, given that. So if you look at Edmund Burke, this is a very famous quote from Burke. He talks about being attached to the subdivision, what the Catholics call subsidiaries. There's this idea, we have a family, we have a neighborhood, we have a village, a shire, we have a state, and then we have a country, and then we have the community, what they call this, global community of countries. So he's saying to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It is the first link in the series of which we proceed toward a love to our country and to mankind. So you have to love your city. If you're from Bradford, you should love Bradford. Hubb al-watan min al-iman. You should love the place you're from. And you should love it in a way, not that you accept everything about it, but if it needs reformation, then you want to reform it. And you work to reform it, but not in a way that, we tear it all down, in a way that we restore it, tajdeed. And so the interest of that portion of social arrangement is a trust in the hands of all those who compose it. We're given this trust. Our families are a trust. Our neighborhoods are a trust. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ famously said, he's not a believer who goes to sleep satiated while he has neighbors that are hungry, because it's a trust. And in the Zahiri madhab, you're supposed to make sure 40 neighbors from all directions. There's no hungry homes in that area. So they took that very seriously. And as none but bad men would justify it in abuse, none but traitors would barter it away for their own personal advantage. This is like what's happening in America right now with the split in the MAGA movement. There's people that really, they want to focus on their own platoon, and then there's a whole other group that said, no, we have this other platoon, that's more important. And so these are themes that will recur again and again in our societies. So this is basically the Georgian. You had the squire and the manor, and then these people had a responsibility to make sure there weren't hungry people in their shire. And this is why you will see in her novels taking food to needy families, looking after, making sure that people are well. My favorite character, which is Anne Elliot, she goes and visits Mrs. Smith. And just the name Smith, it's a very low name. The Elliots are obsessed with, her father is just a hilarious character because he's just complete narcissist and obsequious. He's a baronet, which was the kind of lowest in the whole ranking of, and it was also not necessarily an inherited. It was given. So, but he's obsessed with just who you're connected to, and he's like, you're going to visit Mrs. Smith, like Smith, because that's a tradesman's name. It's not one of the, it's not in, the peerage. Like, I think she begins it by talking about where their name was in the book of notable families. So that's the squire, and then you have this parsonage, and then you have the shire, the community, which gentry, and this is the rise of gentry, and Austen is from the gentry. She's not, although her mother has some aristocratic, she was a lay, and she did have some aristocratic connections, but her father was gentry. And then the tradesmen and the servants, and the tradesmen were beginning to become more powerful just because they were making more money. So this is the manor, and she has the ideal, and then she has the reality. So now we get into logic and emotion. And this comes from Dr. Cleary, who I talked about earlier. Dr. Cleary says, thinking and feeling are two fundamental capacities, sense and sensibility. So in Persian, and the Persians are great readers of global literature, the Iranian people, their scholars are very, very knowledgeable about Western philosophy, unlike most of the scholars from other parts of the Muslim world who, I've met many, they study Heidegger, they study, I was with Ayatollah Eravani. I asked him, what did you do your PhD on? He said on Jacques Maritain, French metaphysician. So Khomeini was very steeped in Western philosophy. So they really understand that, but they also translate all the great novels. So Dostoevsky is in Persian, but they translate it as aql and ihsas. Aql va ihsas. That's how sense and sensibility is translated, which is a more clear translation because most people don't associate sensibility anymore with feeling. But that's what she was talking about. Sensibility is feeling, it's emotion, it's being sensitive. And this is the Romantics who really believed that feelings were more important than reason, to feel things. And this is why Marianne feels things deeply. When Brandon first meets Eleanor, they're talking about Marianne, and he sees something in Marianne of somebody that he loves. He said, oh, she sees that a person could only have one attachment in their life, one love. And Eleanor says, absolutely. This is the only way she could view, because she's a romantic. When they're out and she's looking at all the trees and she's with Edward, and she thinks Edward's a total dead fish. It's totally uninteresting. So he says thinking and feeling are two fundamental capacities. So this is thinking would be Eleanor, feeling would be Marianne. But remember, Marianne is very bright. She's not a silly or a stupid person. She has intellect. And we also know that Eleanor feels deeply. Like Eleanor, when Edward visits Eleanor, and he's very cold when he first visits her at the cottage, Miss Austen says that she felt this deep resentment to the way he was behaving towards her after being so nice to her at Norland. And then she says, but she suppressed those feelings because her reason took control of her emotion, whereas Marianne would just blurt it out. And so he says that they're brought into play during the process of learning, whether through formal methods or through absorption and digestion of the impacts of everyday life. So in the empiricism of Georgian England, experience was very important. So she's heavily influenced by Locke. This idea of there's no innate ideas, that everything comes out of experience. And so experience is extremely important to her, Jane Austen. Thinking and feeling are not only interact with the inner senses and outer environment, but they also interact with each other. So this is a tension. And Jane Austen is really about, and all of her novels will display this, is finding this balance between thinking and feeling. This is what the Dionysian and the Apollonian sensibilities. So, Nietzsche identified this. If you read the Bacchus, it's probably one of the best examples of, Dionysius, this god of feeling, and how it can easily move into just real violence, because a lot of revolutions come out of feeling, of this immense resentment that the 99% start feeling towards the 1%. And it can be quite brutal. But also, sense without sensibility can also be very dangerous, because this is what leads to concentration camps. This is what leads to starving your enemies, because it's thinking, what's the best way to deal with this problem without any human feeling? So as human beings, we're sentient, but we're sapiential. We're sentient creatures. We feel, but we also think. If those aren't in balance, all the troubles come from either one or the other. And so her novels are about bringing these two into a kind of harmony, so that we can think to the appropriate proportions and also feel to the appropriate proportions. That when empathy is appropriate, we express empathic feelings. And when that kind of hardness is appropriate also sometimes, because sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. And that is a true statement. So this product of complex relationships can be employed beneficially for educational purposes. But it can also be used in a sinister manner for purposes of mind control. And so if you look at like Willoughby, you see, here's somebody who has already debauched a girl, and Marianne is completely susceptible to this kind of mind control, because he knows what to say to her. He's quoting, love is not love that alters when it alteration finds. He has keys to her heart, and young girls are very susceptible to this, which many men know this. In fact, there's a book in America called The Player's Bible, which teaches men how to seduce women. And it's a very sick book, but there are men that this is, and it's become obviously much easier to do because we don't have the type of social constraints that we had in the past that protected women from the abuse of the Willoughbys of the world. And so this is what she's really doing, and that's why it's very important for young girls to read these books at that level, because they can see the Wickhams and the Willoughbys. And one of my father said the greatest gift that great literature gives you is that it teaches you that appearances and reality are not the same thing. Kind Iago, Iago's, he's a good counselor, Iago, right? Like, Othello has no idea what this devil's up to. In the end, he sees his hoofed feet, he realizes he's a devil, but he's completely fooled by him, and he ends up killing his beloved wife because he's been polluted by this man. Wickham is a great character. I think he's here next week, the guy that played him. I'm not going to be here, but it'd be interesting to, if he justifies the character, I don't know. But Jane Austen is in the tradition of forgiveness. So she's a very forgiving writer. And this is from her Christianity. So her characters rarely really get what's coming to them. She's very forgiving in that way. So how do we reprocess emotion? The dangers inherent in arbitrary association of emotion and logic, dangers such as unconscious vulnerability to the mechanism of excitation and arrest. So this is a term that he translates out of Chinese manuals for kind of social control. He wrote a book, a very, very interesting book called Thunder from the Sky. And it's basically an emperor's manual on how to control a society. And so he talks about excitation and arrest. So what you do is you evoke a lot of excitation about something, and that arrests the attention of the people. So right now, everybody's focused on Iran. Nobody's thinking about Gaza. Like, this is excitation and arrest. So suddenly Gaza just disappears, even though what's happening now is more horrific. You know, it's really stunning what they're getting away with. But that's a good example of that, of where you distract, and then you're able to accomplish things that you wouldn't be able to in normal situations. It can be mitigated by understanding emotional reprocessing and bringing it within the domain of deliberate consciousness. And again, this is one of Dr. Cleary's main attempts at helping people really realize a conscious state of awareness and well-being. So 2 classical models of emotional reprocessing illustrate how differences in individual intellectual development are related to differences in emotional development. So the first model represents what he would call emotional logic. So Willoughby is under the control of emotional logic. Several of her characters have this quality. But this is certainly Marianne in her immature period, because Marianne is going to have an incredible epiphany and an amazing growth. And this is always, she's taking her heroine through some type of maturation that will enable her to become the lady of the parsonage or the lady of the house. So like Fanny Bryce, and then Anne Elliot, her last novel takes it to a whole other level, because it's no longer about the manor, it's about the ocean. Like she's transcended England and moves on to a whole other. I think that's her most mystical of all her novels, personally. But you also see the fall. So she really understands the fall, that we are no longer in the Edenic state. You know, we're outside of paradise. And that's why she has, like Pemberley is described as a paradise. She's got, you know, the estates are often described as paradise. So this is trying to get back to the garden. And so she'll have literal falls, like the Musgrave girl who falls when they're at the sea, and Wentworth is not able to catch her, and she literally falls. Also, Marianne, she falls, and that's where Willoughby finds her. So this is the fallen state, and they're very susceptible to, you know, they have this vulnerability in that state. And so the first is sorrow. So there's sorrow. So when they lose Norland, the mother has sorrow, and then it's self-pity, but then she's angry because, I mean, Fanny, you know, Dashwood, she even wants the silverware that belonged to the I mean, she's so greedy. She wants to literally take the personal property of Mrs. Dashwood so that she can, you know, keep it in the estate. It's unbelievable. So anger, and then blame, and then obviously rationalization. So this is emotional logic. This is where the emotions are completely dictating how you look at things. And that's why Marianne's always angry. She's very angry about what's happening to her. But here's what he calls logical emotion, which is sorrow and then detachment. So you're able to get out of your emotional state. You're able to look at it. And this allows for reflection, and then you get compassion. And this is, the Prophet ﷺ is the master of logical emotion, because he's never taken outside of the hub. He's always in the hub. He's never affected by, and he always wants to guide people. One of my favorite hadiths is when Ikrimah became Muslim, and Ikrimah's father, Abu Jahl, fought the Prophet horribly. And when Ikrimah became Muslim, he said, I always knew good would come from your father. This is such an amazing statement. Because he was known as Abu al-Hakam before. So this is, the Prophet is Rahmah. And so he's always in that state where he's able to detach, to reflect, and to have compassion, even the most difficult. Another thing about reprocessing of emotion, the projection of anger and blame, which is based on self-pity, feeling sorry for oneself, makes the individual susceptible to divisive and defensive sentiments. The development of reflection and compassion enable the individual to exercise autonomy in the association of feeling and reason. So you're not manipulated by them anymore. You see them for what they are. They're two wings. You need both of them. But you have to be in control, with the result that one cannot be deceived or psychologically manipulated by emotionally charged rationalizations. Another central theme here with her is obviously manners and morals. And she, like Edmund Burke, would have seen morals as more important than laws, because morals, when you have manners and morals, this prevents breakdowns. Laws work out of fear. Manners and morals work out of, it's what they would call, there's a deontological, there's a sense of duty. One of the things that one of my father's teachers said was, he was asked a question where he was asked, knowing the world as it is, can a person really be happy in the world? Knowing how much misery there is in the world and how much suffering, can a person be happy in the world? And he said, oh yes. He said, people of big souls know that there's a duty to be happy. Because part of the reason why the world is so miserable is there's so many unhappy people in it. And so you're just contributing to the misery of the world by being miserable yourself. And people like to be around people that are sanguine, that bring joy in their lives. They don't like to be around people that are constantly whining, constantly, downers. They say misery likes company, but nobody likes to be in miserable company. So if you look again, non-standard, solecism is non-standard ungrammatical usage of language, like we was robbed, right? A branch of manner, although there is a rhetorical scheme that uses solecisms, they can be very effective. Malcolm X used them on occasion. A breach of manners or etiquette. So isn't it interesting that they associated bad grammar and a breach of manners or etiquette, and then any error, impropriety, and inconsistency. You'll see this in the novel, where Eleanor is constantly trying to remind Marianne of decorum and the importance of manners, and that there's certain things that you should say and do because it's appropriate. There's this wonderful scene where she says to her, something like, well, I know that it wasn't wrong because it felt right. I felt the pleasure of it. And Eleanor warns her that, pleasure does not always evince the propriety of an employment. Just because you feel good about doing it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And she says, oh, no, on the contrary, that's proof. So this is one of the real crises of our modern society, is this breakdown of just basic common decency and manners. People just don't care. You can also see it in dress. One of the hallmarks of all traditional cultures is people dressed well, because they understood that you don't dress for yourself, you dress for others. So it's a kind of service to other people. Imam Shafi'i said that there's no israf, there's no extravagance in scent, because it's for others, it's not for yourself, it's a kind of charity. One of the epiphanies I had was in Turkey. We were in the north on the Black Sea, and there was we went into this cafeteria, and there was a sign, because in a lot of countries when they put things into English, they get them wrong. But this one they got right. It said, you serve yourself. So instead of just saying self-serve, it said, you serve yourself. And I realized why we're in a self-serve world, because everybody's serving themselves. And so Allah's taken away from our world the idea of serving others. And that's why, people are rude now. How many times you go into places where customer used to be king? Really? And it's just like, I went to, I had a problem with this bank, and I said, I have money in this bank. He said, well, lots of people have money in this bank. I was like, okay. So I moved the bank. But it's very interesting. You serve yourself. So in a self-serve world, you're serving yourself. The Egyptians have a wonderful phrase that means watch out. They say, khalli balik min nafsik, which I'm convinced came from some arif billah, this Gnostic, because if you look at it just linguistically, what it means empty your mind of yourself. Like, that's how you watch out. Like, empty your mind of yourself. And this story is about, it's really about sacrifice and learning that life is not just about your own pleasures and your own concerns, but the concern of others. And there's wonderful characters. I haven't gone into all of them. Obviously, they have the wonderful relatives, and Miss Jennings is a wonderful character. And they're kind of a little crude, the Middletons, and they're uncouth. Marianne doesn't like them, but they're actually decent, good people. And that's very important in her novels. She has these characters that are, they're not the most cultured, the most erudite, but they're good people. This is a very important statement of John Milton. It was Plato's opinion that an alteration in the style and fashion of dress portends grave disorders and changes in the state. I would maintain, rather, that when the language falls into corruption and decay, the downfall of the state and a period of degradation and obscurity are at hand. For it is not the use of words which are illiterate and mean, incorrect in form, or wrongly pronounced. For is it not the use of words which are illiterate and mean, incorrect in form, and wrongly pronounced, a very clear indication of a slothful and sluggish disposition among the people, and a proneness to submit to any form of slavery? On the other hand, we have never heard of an empire or a country which did not enjoy at least moderate prosperity as long as its people continued to cultivate and take a proper pride in their language. I think you can't underestimate the importance of that statement, which is why grammar was so important in the Muslim world. The study of grammar, the preservation of knowledge, and one of the worst aspects of our modern society is the vulgarity. There's just so much vulgarity. There are other adjectives, than the F word. It's just amazing how just people use that word over and over constantly. And we have a very rich language. You can say lots of things in our language. What an extraordinary concert that was. It was not a matter of decorum. And then this is from Tony Tanner, who wrote a very interesting book about Jane Austen, but he said it was not a matter of decorum for its own sake. Good manners and morals were seen as essential to the preservation of order in society. They alone could or should do what excessive laws and often recalcitrant militia and the absence of any properly organized police force were. It was, in other words, when people govern themselves, they don't need government. It was as if the security and stability of the nation depended on good manners. To put it bluntly, good manners were no longer regarded merely as a seemly adjunct to the lifestyle of the upper classes. They became England's answer to the French Revolution. Whereas in the earlier part of the 18th century, the ruling class had often been associated with libertinism. Moral laxity and varying degrees of coarseness and boorishness, it was now felt that only by reforming their principles and conduct could they preserve their position, their property, and secure the peace of the country as a whole. Jane Austen's profound concern with good manners was thus not simply a reflection of a cloistered gentility. It was a form of politics, an involvement with a widespread attempt to save the nation by correcting, monitoring, and elevating its morals. This is from Sayyid Naqib al-Attas. Confusion and error in knowledge, creating the condition for the loss of adab, which is courtesy, morality, hierarchy within the community. The condition arising out of 1 and 2, in other words, confusion of knowledge and then loss of adab, loss of courtesy, is the rise of leaders who are not qualified for valid leadership of the community, who do not possess the high moral, intellectual, and spiritual standards required for leadership, who perpetuate the condition in 1, which is a confusion about knowledge, above, and ensure the continued control of the affairs of the community by leaders like them who dominate in all fields. So adab is courtesy, discipline, literature, decorum. Before, I just want to read one thing. This is from Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor is paired in the parsonage because Eleanor she has the light of God. And so she is Edward Ferrars. She's going to be his anchor. And he's somebody who clearly doesn't want the world, which in her ideal world, because she often makes fun of the parsonage and she makes fun of like Mr. Collins, who's this ridiculous character. And he's so obsequious and horrible in Pride and Prejudice. But she gives Marianne to Brandon. And Brandon, so this is the estate. So the secular is Marianne and Brandon, which has more room for feeling. They have to have more feeling in taking care, because their responsibilities are the secular welfare of the Shire. Whereas Eleanor and Edward, theirs are going to be the spiritual needs of the community. So it's an amazing pairing that she does in the novel. But she says about Marianne, she says, Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions. This is a great gift, to discover the falsehood of your own opinions, and to counteract by her conduct her most favorable maxims, because she realizes the whole romantic thing was just ridiculous. She was born to overcome an affection formed so late in life as 17, and with no sentiment superior to strong esteem and lively friendship, voluntarily to give her hand to another, and that other, a man who had suffered no less than herself. See, again, she's recognizing that it's not just the women that suffer. Under the event of a former attachment, whom 2 years before she had considered too old to be married. You know, she sees his vest, he wears that vest, and she's like, guy's an old man. That only old men wear vests like that. The flannel waistcoat. And who still sought the constitutional safeguard of a flannel waistcoat. But so it was, instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, this is her great warning to young girls, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting, instead of remaining with her mother and finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, as afterwards, in her more calm and sober judgment, she had determined on. She found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. So this is her economy of salvation, economia. It's restoring the household. And she says that it's religion, and she says it's religion, reason, and sound employment, meaning activities, that will heal her from the trauma of what happened with Willoughby. So again, even though Austen does not constantly preach to us, it's always there, and it would have been understood by her readers. So in her prayer, she says, know that just as the servant of God has from the beginning of the day to obtain his soul's agreement with truthful admonition, so by day's end he has a time within which to demand an accounting and to examine his soul for all it has or has not done. In their mundane concerns, the merchants of this world act in similar fashion with their associates at the end of every year, month, or day. They are fearful of omitting anything of the world that might be a boon to them. If that were to happen to them, they would have only a few days left to rectify the balance. How can a reasonable man fail to examine his soul about what relates to the danger of eternal damnation or salvation? Surely such indulgence is due to the forgetfulness, ghafla, failure, and success denied, qillat al-tawfiq by God. From this we seek refuge in God. So that's Imam al-Ghazali's from his Kitab al-Muraqaba wa Muhasaba. And here's Jane's Muraqaba and Muhasaba. Look with mercy, and this is her prayer to God. Look with mercy on the sins we have this day committed, and in mercy make us feel them deeply, that our repentance may be sincere and our resolution steadfast of endeavoring against the commission of such in future. Teach us to understand the sinfulness of our own hearts and to bring to our knowledge every fault of temper and every evil habit in which we have indulged to the discomfort of our fellow creatures and the danger of our own souls. May we now and on each return of night consider how the past day has been spent by us and what we have been and what have been our prevailing thoughts, words, and actions during it, and how far we can acquit ourselves of evil. Have we thought irreverently of thee? Have we disobeyed thy commandments? Have we neglected any known duty or willingly given pain to any human being? Incline us to ask our hearts these questions, O God, and save us from deceiving ourselves by pride and vanity. Give us a thankful sense of the blessings in which we live, of the many comforts of our lot, that we may not deserve to lose them by discontent and indifference. This is a stunning prayer. So, alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Sheikh. Inshallah. Interestingly, I wanted to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim just to start off with this brief discussion with you, Sheikh. 250 years of Jane Austen. She hasn't really fallen prey to the cancel culture, per se, right? I mean, you have now, the feminists will claim her, some of the radical sort of social movements will claim her. What do you think is it about her writing that's kind of led to this, people kind of adapting and reading and taking from her characters and her complex sort of interactions and everything for their own?
I mean, I think because she is a truly great writer, when they did the Great Books movement in the probably 1920s, it really starts with Erskine at Columbia University. A group of these scholars at the University of Chicago got together to identify the greatest books of Western civilization. And they did not include a Jane Austen novel in that. Later, they actually recognized that they were remiss in leaving her out. And I think the one they chose was Pride and Prejudice, I'm pretty sure. But she is a great writer. And she can be read on all these different levels. And then again, one of the points that she makes in her novel is you can see things completely you can be completely deluded by your perspective. And so people, the postmodernists say that in the past they said seeing is believing, but the postmodernists inverted that and say believing is seeing. And there is a lot of truth in that, that if you believe something, if you go in thinking, I mean, people have seen Mansfield Park as a really anti-slavery, but it's very slight what she says. There's kind of a silence when they ask about the slavery in the West Indies. They all go silent, and I think that was her point, is that nobody wanted to talk about it, the horrors of it. But to try to make it out to be an anti-slavery novel, which some have done, I think would be just a gross overreach.
Right. So Michael Giffen, who wrote that, who's the Australian
he's an Anglican priest.
Amazing and a literary scholar.
No, amazing book. Yeah.
So he writes that book, Religion and Salvation in the Georgian Age, right? Related to Jane Austen. Yeah. In it, he talks about how she's really emphasizes oikonomos, or the idea of the stewardship of the family, like a centrality. And you obviously brought that up in the presentation. One of the interesting things is that he also mentions that her characters, especially the heroines and the ones that she's really celebrating, they're kind of they're prototypes of the supremacy of reason. He says they're not necessarily imaginative or even real, but they're people that, prototypes of reason that he's trying to show, or she's showing through her characters, how, like for example, and you mentioned in Eleanor, she has that ability to suppress feelings and then to overcome that, right? And he brings that up. He also says, and I wanted to get your feedback on this, that she actually has this kind of discursive rhetoric in her stories. Right. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the authorial voice is very strong.
Yeah.
She's not in that way, because there's people that read her as a kind of realist, in the modern, but she's definitely, her voice is so strong, and then she's got this omniscience, so she knows what's going, and her knowledge of the human heart, and this is the great gift of these great writers. I mean, we have in our own tradition people like Ghazali, who just knew the human heart, and they wrote amazing books on psychology, subhani, Ahmed Zarruq. I mean, these are great, but great novelists have that gift. Dostoevsky is one of the great, I think, most important writers for this time, for people that really want to understand the modern society. And I think Jane Austen, this sense and sensibility, because we are in the world of sensibility. This is the age of feeling. Everybody's just triggered. Everybody's gets upset. Everybody's just, how you make me feel. I didn't make you feel anything. Your feelings are your own. And if you react to something I said, you've allowed something in, because a lot of people just don't let other people affect them. I mean, there are sociopaths that are able to do that. And it's a natural thing to be affected by negativity. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, Allah says, that he said, يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ, like you feel constriction in your heart by what they're saying. So the Prophet was affected by what people said, but Allah told him, just sabbih bihamdi rabbika, just say subhanallah, and just do sajda. Don't let them take control of your inner state. Like, you have to guard your inner state. What's inside you, nobody can control. That's been given to you, and that's why you can be in a prison and be free, and you can be free and be in a prison.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what she was witnessing, like you mentioned, they went through the civil wars here in England, and then what happened in the French Revolution. So she saw that there was a breakdown that was happening. So there was a great concern about that. And here we are today, and we're all concerned about a breakdown.
What's happening? It's all breaking down.
So she's looking to find a mode of salvation. And this is where then I wanted to bring up where revelation, I mean, you can have reason, but it's revelation that's going to anchor that, right? And then redirect you towards goodness.
Yeah.
And her Anglicanism obviously comes through in the novels through
Yeah,
characters
it's very
like
clear.
Eleanor.
Like you can't understand. I really genuinely believe that you cannot understand her without understanding the world. She was part of the clergy. She grew up in a house of clergy, and I mean these people prayed a lot, and she was a very devout woman. She struggled with herself, like I said, and she felt guilty because she, you know, she just saw people so clearly. And Ibn Ata'illah says it's a great danger to have the unveilings of others, you know, to see people in their foibles. It's a great danger because you can kind of fall into a contempt of people and just see their ridiculousness. And so it's very dangerous because you have to compassion. I mean, one of my favorite prayers of the Prophet ﷺ is when he saw people afflicted, he said privately to himself, Alhamdulillah alladhi afani mimman ibtalakum bihi wa faddalani ala kathiran mimman khalaqa tafdila. It's a very important dua. You know, he said it to himself. He didn't say it so that the other person could hear, but he said he thanked God that he didn't try himself with the same tribulation that other person had. And to see people in tribulation as opposed to see them as like evil. That's what, I mean, I think in her novels, the compassion that she has, she really sees these people, they're in tribulation.
Yeah.
And that evinces compassion. And when you lose that sight, you can just become really a very hard-hearted person, and you lose that sight. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was able to sit with the most people that had committed the most heinous crimes. And he was able to sit with them and embrace them as brothers and sisters. I mean, Hind bint Abi Sufyan, like he sat with her. She'd bitten into the liver of his beloved uncle, but he sat with her and he accepted her Islam. I mean, it's amazing. And he couldn't do that if he had if he carried that bitterness and that resentment.
Well, it's like you said, that journey from sorrow to compassion.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the logical emotion.
Yeah. She also, Sheikh, I think it's the idea of just not playing this victimhood, because in some sense, in every sense, people can say, well, I was wronged in this, but she's basically making a case that you have to be responsible for your choices and your decisions.
That's true, but it's also another thing is when you start seeing the world as under providential control, then you begin to see everything as a tribulation. And you can actually rise above a lot of the problems of the world. When you see that everything is from God,
right.
Then you're free. As long as you're trapped in the he said, she said, he did, she did, and not see that every situation is a situation where God is giving you a chance to grow, either through forbearance, through patience, through gratitude. I mean, there are a number of reactions to any situation. I think one of the things that has struck so many people is the reaction of so many of these extraordinary Palestinian people who've been under the most horrific conditions, and yet they're hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil. And people have become Muslim from just seeing the faith of these people. And I was told by somebody who visited Jerusalem many years ago that what struck them most was the kind of sakina that they saw in so many of the people there, despite the fact these people are under occupation. You know, Allah just gave them a kind of sakina to exist in the most difficult circumstances. But, you know, we're a resilient species, but iman, more than anything else, it's faith that enables people to get through the most difficult times. And people without faith will break much quicker than people with faith. So I think hope is just, it's raja is such an important virtue, and to you know, it's one of the great theological virtues. And just in these novels, I think you see that, like the resilience of these people that go through great tribulations. I mean, they're great tribulations. It's all relative, obviously. I mean, you know, in the case of Sense and Sensibility, I mean, Marianne, you know, she was, you know, almost deflowered. She You know,
She suffered.
she really suffered. She went into a deep depression, but she came out of it with this spiritual maturation that enables her to see the world in a completely different way. And the amazing denouement of when she realizes that how deep the feelings of her sister were. You know, it's just such a powerful recognition scene where
Yeah, because she used to dismiss her before.
she just thought she had no emotion.
Yeah.
She just thought, but she did. She was so in control of it. And I think learning these lessons through literature is really useful because it'll enable you just to it's, you know, السعيد من اتعظ بغيره. Sayyidina Omar used to say, the real felicitous one is that learns the lessons of others. You know, not having to go through the lesson yourself. And that's part of what literature, great literature, enables you to really learn a lot about the world without having to experience it firsthand if you take those lessons seriously. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of the most amazing aspects of the Quran is that Allah gives us these powerful stories to reflect on. So if you feel tribulation from your family, read Surah Yusuf.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
At least they didn't throw you into a well.
Yeah, among other things.
I mean, sometimes you feel like it, but yeah. I mean, they actually plotted to kill him.
Yeah, exactly. And then, Sheikh, I think we're a little bit over time, so we'll just end with a couple more comments from yourself. But a lot of people have brought up repeatedly here at the festival and elsewhere that there's just so much suffering that we're now keenly aware of just because of technology that comes so close to us. And how do you cope with that? And you mentioned it before, obviously, that we have to be hopeful and we have to remain happy. But I think for a lot of people is that how in this day and age do we find this balance, right?
Well, thank God there are people that, I mean, I met a woman once in Washington, D.C. I was at a fundraiser for the Rohingyas, and I gave a talk, and there was a lady there. Her whole life was dedicated to the Rohingyas. She wasn't a Muslim, but that's what she dedicated her life to. And the best thing we do is support people like that, you know, because not everybody can drop everything for every crisis, because the world's filled with crises. But there are these amazing people that make that their work. And if it's positive work, it's always, that's one way that you can do is to help others do that work. The Prophet ﷺ said, كلكم راع وكل راع مسؤول عن رعيته. Each one of you is a shepherd, and you are responsible for your flock. And so it's very important to look at what your ra'iyah is. What are you responsible for? Because we have circles of concern. You know, we should all be concerned about things happening in the world, because there are many, many things that are very troubling. And what you can do, you know, we've done, people, you know, there's people that want, you know, everybody to virtue signal and say what they're doing or tweet every 5 minutes. I've never tweeted. I don't have Instagram. I don't even know what Instagram is. I don't have Facebook. I don't have any of those things. I'm not online. I really am not online. There's people that do it. I mean, you remember I shut down the Facebook because I told them I don't believe in it. I'm against it. I think it's very unhealthy stuff. People need to get back to their platoons, you know, to their communities. You should know your neighbor and not have friends 10,000 miles away that you've never met, you know, and you don't even know your neighbor's name. I mean, that's just embarrassing. But what happened was somebody made a Facebook, a phony one,
fraud,
and these poor Malay people wanted to invite me to Malaysia. They ended up being defrauded of $50,000. And so we had to put up a Facebook again just to be an official one for that reason. It's horrible. There's all these people scamming other people. Yom al-Qiyamah is going to be a really great day, by the way. I'm serious. It's going to be a good day, and everybody will see who everybody is. Just wait. Allah says, تَرَبَّصُوا فِنِي مَعَكُمْ مِنْهُمْ مُتَرَبِّصِينَ انْتَظِرُوا فِنِي مَعَكُمْ مِنْهُمْ. Just be patient. Just wait. It's all going to come clear. You're going to see who's who was the munafiq, who was the good person. You're going to see on the mixed people. Everybody's going to be people with, you know, the flags of treachery that come out of their backsides. You know, everybody's going to be seen, and it's all going to be exposed. Alhamdulillah. It's going to be a good day.
Inshallah.
Allah says in the Quran that the believers, they actually look forward to the Day of Judgment. It's not something not to look forward to. It's going to be a good day. Even the dog will have his day. Even the dog will have his day. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. MashaAllah.
Yeah.
Full house. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bradford. For those of you who are from Bradford, we love this city. I've come here several times, and you've always just been so welcoming and warm. May Allah bless this event and increase it and make it a source of edification, inspiration, and also, you know, we should pray for people everywhere, but also recognize that we have responsibilities right in front of us. There's a lot we can do in our own towns and cities and neighborhoods, you know. So this is a great city, and there's a lot of Muslims here, and we need the economy of salvation, economia, you know, really the true economics, which is a moral concern of just making this place a better place and contributing to its welfare and to the welfare of its people, whatever race or nationality or religion that they have. That's what the Muslims, Allah says in the Quran, "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas." You're the best community that came out for humanity. He didn't say for yourselves. And we should be for all people. This is the responsibility of Muslims, to be for everybody, not just for themselves. Jazakumullah khairan. Yeah.